Thank you for this very nice invitation to give this lecture here in this town of Evora, where I came actually 14 years ago after the 11th ECO meeting, last time I was here. So I'll speak on behalf of SIOG, the International Society of Geriatric Oncology, that I'm currently the president-elect, and I'll assume the presidency from next fall after the annual conference, which will be held in Lisbon in October. So I'm a medical oncologist working in France, in Paris area, on a hill on the west side of Paris, which is called Saint-Cloud. And the center in which I work merged with Institut Curie 4 years ago, and we are now a big institution with many sites. And I'm dealing with medical oncology and with a special focus on geriatric oncology, obviously. So just to start, you know perfectly well, that you have a general process of aging which is quite universal and which is a bit concerning, but which is faced by Western countries as well as developing countries like BRIC countries. And for example, you can see that in North Africa, the number of the elderly population are going to catch up the ones that we observe currently in Western Europe, in France or in Germany in the next two decades. So that's a general process. And in parallel, I don't know how it works. Yes. So that's a general process. The aging is a general process, universal. And in parallel, cancer incidence is increasing according to age, and much more in the upper strata of the population. From 65 or above 80, the number of cases increase much more than before in younger adults. And this incidence, the projection for the next 2 decades, are very important, and should raise our attention to this issue. So to start, I would like to take just a clinical case to illustrate a bit the problem raised by the management of elderly cancer patients. And this lady of 80 years old had been operated in 2006 by our team for breast cancer, an early stage breast cancer, which was a triple negative breast cancer with an aggressive prognosis, and in which very logically we raised the question of adding chemotherapy in adjuvant setting. She was 84, had no previous medical history, but her husband was quite disabled with advanced Parkinson. And at this time, we were running a specific program on the feasibility of standard chemotherapy in elderly women with breast cancer, called GERICO. GERICO is a group of clinical research dedicated to geriatric oncology, running in France mostly, and under the auspices of Unicancer. And we wanted to enroll this patient in this program. The geriatrician assessed also the general health status of this patient and said, yes, functional status, the different domains were fine, but identified 3 faults in the past year. So what happened? What happened is that we didn't enroll the patient in our program because she didn't meet the eligibility criteria because of these faults. But the medical staff decided to treat her with adjuvant chemotherapy because it was a triple negative case, and decided to go for chemotherapy, flying in the face of the decision of the warning raised by the geriatrician. And what happened? What happened is that after a central venous access, she had a first cycle of chemotherapy and actually developed febrile neutropenia and developed a severe stroke, probably revealed or that we could have anticipated because of faults which revealed cardiac arrhythmia, actually. So that illustrates, it was a bit a decline following this management, because the chemotherapy was stopped. She received reduced radiotherapy. Her husband was placed in a nursing home. She got sequelae, and everything dégringolade, as you say in French. So that was the issue. So obviously, today we are not anymore as in the ancient times when Geras Geras is here on the slide. He personified the elderly in the ancient times, and he was an old pensioner of the Mount Olympus. But he was hit also by Hercule. The young Hercule was hitting Geras on this Péliquet, watched by Hebe, the goddess of youth. So obviously we've improved since ancient times and we respect our elderly. But still we swing between extreme positions very often in oncology for elderly, because we swing between a position extreme of not giving any treatment because patients are too old, and that's not, you cannot sustain this position anymore today, and a blind therapeutic enthusiasm sometimes developed in oncology for futile benefits provided by treatments. And so we need to have an intermediate position that we can develop because of a good collaboration with different specialty, oncology and geriatrics. That's the basis of geriatric oncology. Obviously, why is it that? Because firstly, we don't have so many data from published reports, scientific reports, regarding the management of treatments in the elderly population. When you look at registration data, trials, or cooperative trials run by the SWOG, by cooperative groups, very often the number of old patients are very limited and do not match at all what you face in the daily life. You have always a representation which is very low, very limited. So that's an issue. Obviously, you can derive some benefit from standard treatment that you use in oncology. For example, standard adjuvant chemotherapy can provide some benefit to these elderly patients. That was very well demonstrated by Hyman Muss regarding the adjuvant chemotherapy trials run by the CLGB. He looked at the difference of benefits according to age, and he showed that in all categories and above 65, patients could derive benefit from adjuvant chemotherapy. What he showed also very well is that the tolerance, the side effects are very different. In terms of toxic deaths, you have 1.5% of toxic death, which is 10 times what you find in younger patients, in younger adults. So that makes the difference. There is a functional decline that you need to be able to assess, to take into account when you make your decision. And that's very important. Unfortunately, for more recent innovative treatments, we have done almost the same mistakes. For all the targeted treatments that we have developed during the past decade, that's an editorial by Arthur in the JCO 2 years ago, we've done the same mistake. We have very limited data in the registration trials for these targeted treatments. And last, to give you an example, when you look at bevacizumab, Avastin, when you look at bevacizumab, taking into account, reviewing the data from large registries like the SEER database, you see that in 65 plus patients, 1/3 has, when you decide to give bevacizumab, actually they got contraindication to this drug. And you use that not very consistently in this elderly population. And when they don't have any contraindication, they develop in 1/3 also complications. So that raises questions how you handle, how you make your decision in these patients. And last but not least, there is a world of the prognostic tools, the new diagnostic tools, genomic tools that is developed for breast, for colorectal, for lung. And unfortunately, we have done also the same mistakes as for standard treatment and as for targeted treatments. Elderly have been most of the time excluded from these trials, investigating these new tools. And for the MINDAC trial, they excluded patients above 70, for example, with MammaPrint. So, what is the crux? What is the knot? Where do we stand? I think one of the most important problems is how we assess the heterogeneity of aging, the heterogeneity of this population above a certain age. And what is very important to look is that it's, you may be a woman of 90 years old. You can have, if you're very fit, you can have 7 years in front of you, and you can be 15 years younger and have the same life expectancy if you're in the lower centile of the population. And that's this heterogeneity which is very difficult to capture, and that the oncologist cannot capture so easily alone. And that derives from mostly from the comorbidity, the multimorbidity, which increase in incidence and in severity according to age. That's hypertension, that's heart disease, that's diabetes, that's cognitive problems. And that's, for example, in the US population, you have above 65, almost half of the population got hypertension, and a third got heart disease. So how you take that into account when you make your decision, that's the issue, because that creates a climate of competing risks for mortality, for prognosis. And if you look at the causes of death attributed to cancer in black here, and those attributed to comorbidity, you see that above 70, according to different types of tumor, it varies. For example, for prostate and breast, the comorbidity dominates the prognosis above 70 compared with cancer. And that's not at all the same picture for high-grade lymphoma, in which the neoplasia dominates always the prognosis. So that's the key. And it's a bit as if you are the oncologist in the middle with this heterogeneous process to measure, to assess, these numbers of increasing cases to deal with, limited scientific data, significant side effects and mortality, and the wish to approach or to estimate life expectancy. So how you do that? You have actually two worlds confronting each other, the world of oncology and the world of geriatrics, and both need to find a way to collaborate. The world of oncology is a fast-moving world, very dedicated to gene expression profiles, to the molecular portrait of each tumor, while in geriatrics, you look more at quality of life, the quantity of life, of quality, with good quality, and that relies mostly on what is called the comprehensive geriatric assessment. The comprehensive geriatric assessment, what is it? Because you have different goals, you see, between these two populations. The young population is more orientated towards quantity of life because of family obligations, and the elderly population is more focused on quality of life, independence, and staying at home. So how do you measure this global portrait of patient when the patient is old? And there are some tools, and the tool is the comprehensive geriatric assessment, which reviews different domains which are very important for the global quality of life of these patients, which reviews dependency, comorbidity, the environment, the cognition, the depression, with different scales that you can that the patient can do by himself or through interviews. It depends. And all these scales have impacts in the general elderly population, non-cancer specific, on prognosis. And you need to take that into account when you progress in your treatment decision making. So to give some examples, the functional status, ADL or IADL, two scales, CATS and Lawton, assess the problems in activities of daily living or instrumental ADL. But one decline on one item can have an impact on the 2-year mortality very significant. It's 30% or it's 15%. That needs to be taken into account when you make a decision. And all these items derived from the geriatric assessment can have a significant are useful to predict the toxicity of our treatments. For example, we have these two large cohorts published by Martin Exterman, the CRASH program, and the City of Hope with Artilleria, which assessed different baseline variables from the geriatric assessment mostly on the occurrence of toxicity, hematological and non-hematological, and they found as predictors by multivariate analysis, including some functional status items like IADL or MNA or MMS, cognitive part of the geriatric assessment, as really strong predictors for the occurrence of toxicity. And we know that when you build models with these variables, we are much more discriminant than what you can do as an oncologist with a performance status. When you use a Karnofsky, for example, you cannot distinguish between these patients who are going to develop chemotherapy toxicity, while if you use these ADL or IADL or functional information derived from the geriatric assessment, you can obviously identify those patients who are at risk to develop toxicity. I invite you, for example, also to look at this website, which is very informative, which is a website which provides different scales to assess life expectancy at 1, 2, or 4 years, which match very well the different settings of practice in oncology. In metastatic settings, it can be 1 or 2 years life expectancy that you want to assess, or 4 years in adjuvant setting. And for example, this type of scales, very simply, can give you, like this one, an estimate of the 4-year mortality score in the general elderly population. That's a way to assess, to balance what you try to settle in terms of treatment with the rest, with the general health status. And this scale, for example, review age, some comorbidities, some functional status, and can, with a score, you can assess the 4-year mortality score, which can vary a lot according to this information. And so not to take that into account when you make a decision for oncology seems not correct. And in consequence, does it have an impact in your practice? Yes, it has an impact. It's feasible. You have at least these two big series, but you have others which show very well that when you make a geriatric assessment, you change the therapeutic decisions, the oncological therapeutic decision. If you make a decision of a cancer treatment before and after reviewing the geriatric problems, you change in 20 to 30% of cases your treatment plan. And you change for a de-escalation of your treatment. And that's mostly based on information provided by functional status and nutrition. And it's very constant according to the different series published for very wide, very different tumors, gathering breast, lung, colorectal. You have this information that you can modify that has an impact, a real impact on treatment decision. So one question for geriatric assessment and how you use it is it's a long step. It takes, when you do a full geriatric assessment, it can take 1 hour for a geriatrician. So that's time consuming. And as the French motto says, is it one for all or all for one? We don't know very well, but there was a considerable interest in developing screening tool to make lighter this assessment. And one of these screening tools which has been developed and very well studied, especially in France, is a G8. The G8 is a shorter scale, just able to orientate, to streamline the real full assessment according to a threshold. This scale, you see, has 8 questions regarding nutrition, BMI, self-health rated by the patient, and status, and cognitive functions. And this G8 have a sensitivity, a quite high sensitivity compared with the VES13. And now the recommendation of the French National Cancer Institute is to use it in any patient above 75. And that helps to, with a threshold of 14, to orientate those with a lower score to the geriatrician to have a full assessment. And actually, when you do that, you have, even for a tumor like breast cancer, you have roughly 2/3 or 60% of your patients who have an alert on this screening tool already, which is quite important to stress. And maybe the last important point that I want to stress is that the impact of this geriatric assessment on the true cancer prognosis is still to be demonstrated, and that will be probably the goal of the next French program run by Pierre Soubeyran, which will look at if, in case of a G8 flashing under 14, whether a G8 guided treatment is better on prognosis, on overall survival, than a standard treatment in a wide population, first line and second line in metastatic setting for different tumors. So this program is going to open very soon, and is going to really demonstrate the value, the added value of this geriatric assessment in the management of cancer patients. Well, to conclude, or to bring us to the conclusion, the SIOG has developed many guidelines specific for different tumor types, and they are reviewed regularly. This one is the last update for the breast cancer management, which was published with Laura Biganzoli in the Lancet Oncology very recently, 2 years ago. And that shows that we can have very specific recommendations for this population. You don't treat that. You need to take into account mostly information derived from the geriatric assessment. You have also a way to split the traditional intermediate category. You know that there is the scheme published by Lodovico Balducci of fit patient, unfit patient, and the intermediate group. Now the intermediate group, you see, it has been split for some tumors like prostate in frail and vulnerable according to whether the general health status is reversible or not reversible. So that gives you the direction that the society is taking to improve the management of these patients. And last point, the society is stress very, very strongly that we need also joint efforts to develop specific research program for this population. They are not in the standard trials that we run. We need specific trials, not maybe for all. Maybe when you're very fit and when there is no age limit in the standard trials, you can enroll them in these trials. But for the vulnerable ones, for the frail ones, you need to have specific questions, especially with co-primary endpoints or different methodologies. And in this way, I just want to mention that the French group, the Jericho group in France, has led a consistent number of trials, you see, along 10 years, focusing on ADL, on geriatric endpoints, and not on oncological endpoints, traditional. And that's one example of what you can do in terms of research. And just to show you that the last trial that we've run, that we've launched in France, which is the ASTA70 trial, which is the assessment of the added value of chemotherapy in 70-plus breast cancer women, ER positive and HER2 negative, and which randomize according to the genomic grade when it's high, endocrine treatment versus endocrine treatment preceded by chemotherapy, which integrate different numbers of geriatric items and which propose a de-escalation of the indication of chemotherapy in these patients. So the trial is running very well, as you can see. We are at half accrual in less than 2 years, so it's really very good. So my key messages are that age and standard approach generally influence treatment decision in 40% of cases, but not always in the right direction. We have many under-treatment, but we have also many over-treatment. It's still frequent in both directions. The access to innovation is unbalanced. We've seen that for the targeted treatments and the modern prognostic tools. So geriatric problems are more frequent than we believe usually. For example, for breast, I mean, if you screen a standard breast cancer population, you see almost 2/3 with an impaired screening tool. CGA impacts on treatment decisions in almost 1/3 of cases, and more treating physicians become aware of CGA results for treatment decisions. So here you got on the left on the left side, the medical oncologist or the oncologist. On the right side, the geriatrician. And geriatric oncology, that's the gathering both specialty in a language and something to share. And that's the goal of the International Society of Geriatric Oncology, of different cooperative groups. That's the Journal of Geriatric Oncology, which is the journal of the society. And that's the next meeting, which will be held in Lisbon in October. And I invite you to join and to have all these debates, which are of key importance for this population, often forgotten in our daily practice. Thank you.